right, well, good morning. Well, it's a joy to be with you this morning as we gather together to worship our great God. My name is Reed. I'm one of the pastors here, and I will add my welcome to Pastor Stevens. I am glad that you're here this morning as we worship God together. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss the kids. They can stand up and head out this front door right here to their classes with their teachers. And I'm sorry, kids, but you're missing out on a good story today, the story of Esther. Well, if you are just joining us, again, we are glad that you are here, but we just last week started our study through the book of Esther. Esther, maybe you have heard of the book, maybe you know the story, but we are digging into it, focusing on God's plans and providence, or rather how we plan, but ultimately God is in control. His providence, not only in the story of Esther, but in our own lives as well. And so as we look at this, our focus has been for this series on the providence of a loving God. Knowing that He is in control, knowing that regardless of what we see going on around us, how we think things aren't going according to our plan, we know that God is in control. And so we've looked at this story, and so I'm going to do a quick just recap of the story. Don't worry, I'm not going to read through the whole first two chapters again. But we saw this story of King Ahasuerus. And he was this mighty ruler, king over the largest empire, one of the largest empires the world has ever known, the Persian Empire. He had power, he had wealth, he had everything. But he was a man controlled by his own pride. And so he throws this big banquet. And at the banquet, where he's showing off his wealth and trying to get those in his kingdom to support him as he gets ready to go off to war against Greece, he gets drunk. And he asks his queen Vashti to come out and parade around before all of these people. And she says no, and in his anger, he gets rid of her. It's amazing that he doesn't kill her knowing this man, but he deposes her as queen and is looking for a new queen. And in this, through God's providence, we see Esther is made queen of the Persian Empire. God is in control, and so that's where we left off with our story. God is already working, placing His people where He wants them. And so here we ended just before the end of chapter 2. And so at the end of chapter 2, we have this interesting part of the story. It doesn't really fit with what's before or coming, so we're just going to look at it before we jump in, but it's important to our story. In verse 19, I'd encourage you to turn with me to the book of Esther. If you need a Bible, there's one right under the seat in front of you, that black Bible there. If you don't have a Bible or that would serve you in some way or someone you know, please take that. That's our gift to you. But you can find Esther chapter 2, the end of this chapter, on page 434 of those Bibles. And so let's go ahead and read that. You can listen as I read out loud. It says this: When the virgins were gathered a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther still did not reveal her family background or her ethnicity, that she was a Jew, as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders, as she always had while he raised her. During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance, became infuriated and planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. When the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. This event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. And so you here, remember, we were introduced to Mordecai. This is Esther's cousin, who's about 15 years older than her, and who really kind of raised her because she didn't have her parents with her. And Mordecai somehow is part of the court of the king, and he was in there sitting at the king's gate and overheard this plot. And so he tells Esther, Esther tells the king, these men are found out, they're executed, and now written in historical record is the fact that Mordecai saved the king's life. And I want you to remember that because we're going to get to that later in our story, not today, but in the coming weeks. We're going to see how this is an important part of the story. Remember this, God is setting up His grand story here in the book of Esther. And He does the same thing in our lives. Everything is purposeful, and He is working behind the scenes. Here, an interesting part of this that we're going to see later in our study through the book of Esther, here it says that these men, as they were executed, they were hanged on the gallows. And I think really a better translation of that would be impaled on a stake. And I know you're like, why are we talking about this morning? It's kind of a gruesome picture, but I want us to understand it because it's going to play a part as we move on in our story. But you say, well, why, if it says there, hanged on the gallows, why would you think that it should be translated impaled on a stake? Well, we see a similar means of execution throughout the Persian Empire. This was typical for them to take prisoners, and in order to make a statement, to have a large pole that's erected and someone impaled on it, a very gruesome death, and a sign to everybody else what happens when you defy the king. In fact, we see a similar means of execution like this in Ezra chapter 6, verse 11. It says this, I also issue a decree concerning any man who interferes with this directive. Let a beam be torn from his house and raised up. He will be impaled on it, and his house will be made into a garbage dump because of his offense. And so you see the same thing. Well, you ask, well, who said this? Who made this decree? Well, the end of that verse 12 says, I, Darius, have issued the decree. Let it be carried out diligently. Now, from last week, remember, we went through this history. Don't make me do it again, because I'll do it. But who remembers who Darius is? It's King Ahasuerus' or Xerxes. It's his father. And so this was typical for them. And another interesting thing in this, in the book of Ezra, we see what also plays an important part in our story is where this was issued. Remember how when a decree by the king is made, nobody can change it. Not even the king himself. We're going to see that in the story. Well, this is taken from right here, this decree. King Darius, Xerxes' father, had issued this decree that the Israelites could rebuild the temple without interference. That no one should interfere with them because his father, Cyrus, had let them do that. And he said, if anyone disobeys my command to let them do that without interference, then this is what's going to happen to them. They're going to be put up on a stake. And so here we see now even as King Ahasuerus makes these decrees, not even he himself can change them because they are set in stone. So that kind of leads into our story. Mordecai has saved the king's life, and it has been recorded in the historical records of the king. So as we get into the rest of the story, our main primary focus is going to be chapters 3 and 4 this morning. I want us to understand this as we continue to look at God's providence in the world, that I must be fully surrendered to God's uniquely designed purpose for my life. I need to be surrendered to God's uniquely designed purpose for my life. That's what we should understand from these next two chapters in our story through the book of Esther. So first of all, I want us to see that surrender, when I say I need to be surrendered to God, what does that look like? Surrender means doing the right thing. Surrender means doing the right thing. I'm going to continue reading, and I'm going to break this up a little bit so we have a breath in between each section that I read. I'll read through chapter 3, which is just 15 verses long. You can follow along as we develop this story. It says this, after all of this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman. So we're introduced to a new character, Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's command? When they had warned him day after day, and he still would not listen to them, They told Haman in order to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, through Ahasuerus' kingdom. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in King Ahasuerus' 12th year, the poor, that is the lot, so the dice that they would roll to make decisions, was cast before Haman for each day in each month. And it fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman informed King Ahasuerus, "There is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." Notice how Haman does that. To be honest, he doesn't care about the king's honor. He cares about his own. But he knows exactly what to say to persuade the king. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction. And I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for deposit in the royal treasury. The king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Then the king told Haman, "The money and people are given to you to do with as you see fit." The royal scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and the order was written exactly as Haman commanded. It was intended for the royal satraps, the governors of each of the provinces, and the officials of each ethnic group, and written for each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with a royal signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to each of the royal provinces, telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. A copy of the text, issued as law throughout every province, was distributed to all the peoples so that they might get ready for that day. The couriers left, spurred on by royal command, and the law was issued in the fortress of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, while the city of Susa was in confusion. And so we see this evil, wicked, deplorable plan hatched by Haman, spurred on simply because he was not being honored by one person. And so, as we look at this first part of the story and we think about our surrender to God and His purpose for our life, we see that surrender involves obedience to God in a wicked world. We look at this passage and we think, how wicked can these people be? That just because one person didn't bow down to this man Haman, he was so angry and frustrated that he wanted to wipe out all of the Jews. And you think, well, how many would that be? We talked last week about where this story fell, and it was after some of the Jews had returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. But actually only it's estimated about 50,000 Jews went back. King Cyrus said, "You're free to go." And so they returned, but many of them, a majority of them, stayed here throughout the Persian Empire. Estimates of about 15 million Jews lived scattered throughout the empire. So you realize what this means. In creating this law that was hatched by one man whose pride was hurt by one person, now he is looking to eradicate and kill 15 million people. It's evil. It's wicked. And so as we are looking at this, we know that Haman was consumed by pride and his lust for power. But it leads us to the question of, as Christians, as Christ followers, in a wicked and perverse world, how do we react? How do we respond to the reprehensible demands of the world around us? It doesn't take long to see what the world wants us to look like and act like, does it? The world tells us to be this, to do that, to say this, to don't say that, or else. Right? Nowadays, maybe it may not be that we're going to kill you, but we'll cancel you. We'll make your life miserable. You won't be a part of this unless you say what we want you to say and you do what we want you to do. How do we react in a world like this? We may not live during Esther's time, but when we look at our world around us, we see very similar things. People consumed by lust and pride and a desire for power, a desire to make us do what they do and look like us. They don't want us to live lives that are different and separate, pursuing God and what He desires and His purpose for us. Every day we face the pressure to conform to a godless culture. It's in our faces. People tell us that it's not that bad, it's okay. And we face this pressure, but we are called to be a light in the darkness. That is what we're called to be as Christians. And to be honest, and in this study, I have said this before, but I don't want us to think that Mordecai and Esther are these people that make no mistakes. Because many of the Jews that were living in these different provinces were not being lights in their community. But here we see Mordecai take a stand. And we don't know exactly why he did this, but we know that he did. He refused to bow. And so as we think about our responsibility, our surrender to a holy God will stand out in a culture of pride and self-promotion. We'll look different. Our surrender will stand out in a culture of shallow Christianity. It may not be that the world's trying to get us to be wicked and evil like them. Maybe it's people who claim to be Christians who say, well, I can say that I'm a Christian, but I can not look that much different from the world. And it's okay. I'm a Christian, but not one of those weird ones, right? I'm normal. Have you heard that before? If being enough like the world so that we fly under the radar and appear normal, if that is our goal, then we are missing God's purpose for our lives. We're missing it. That's not why we're here. We're not trying to look as much like the world as we can so that we're not noticed, so that we fit in. We're called to be different. We're called for a purpose. You say, well, what about the consequences of being obedient when it's not popular? Because there are consequences, aren't there? We're called to be different, to follow God in obedience to His commands. But what about the consequences? Well, we are commanded to show obedience to God regardless of the consequences. Regardless of the consequences. You know, as we read this passage in chapter 3, it seems like Haman succeeds, doesn't it? He gets the royal signet ring, the stamp of approval. It's sent out to everyone. Look what has happened. He succeeded. The law is passed. And everyone knows that once a decree is made, no one, even the king himself, can stop it. How could God allow this? It may lead us to ask the question, or maybe Mordecai asked himself this question, well, what if I just would have bowed down? And in my mind, I know that I wasn't worshiping Him, but I would have just conformed and done it. Wouldn't things be better? Couldn't all of this have been avoided? You see, we don't exactly know why Mordecai wouldn't bow down. It doesn't say, oh, I'm doing this because I will only bow to God. It doesn't say explicitly what that is. But I think that we can assume it was because of his faith. In verse 4, it says that when asked why he wouldn't bow, he told them, the royal staff, that he was a Jew. And I imagine it was saying, I can't. Because I serve God, I cannot bow down. But the reality is this, that he took a stand for what he believed to be right. We must do the same. You know, we can spend all day pondering the what ifs, but we are not in control of the outcome. We must simply do what we know is right and leave the outcome to God. That is what we're commanded to do. We cannot allow a fear of what might come because I obey to keep us from obeying. If we truly trust God and His promises, then we follow Him in obedience and we leave the outcome to Him. Sometimes there are difficult consequences when we do what's right. There are. There are times that we can think, I did the right thing, and things got worse. How could this be? It may appear that way sometimes, like it did for Mordecai. Can you imagine? And we see at the beginning of chapter 4, when Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, since the law prohibited anyone wearing sackcloth from entering the king's gate. There was great mourning among the Jewish people in every province where the king's command and edict reached. They fasted, wept, and lamented, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. We see their sorrow and their lament and their mourning. This is how Mordecai felt. It appears like I did the right thing, and look what happened. How many times have we been there in our lives? But in moments like these, we must remind ourselves of the reality of God's providence. That even in this, God is working. And it's easy for us, and as we continue doing this, if you've read through the story, you know the story of Esther, you know that it ends up working out. And God is sovereign. And that should not be a surprise to us. But in the moments like Mordecai found himself where we do what's right, we take a step of faith, and things don't go like we wanted them to go, we have to remind ourselves of God's promise that He is in control and He is sovereign. He is working even though we may not see it. And He will always reward those who are surrendered to His purpose. We're also reminded of the consequences of failing to obey God. In this passage, if you look, as we're introduced to Haman, how does it describe him? It says, Haman, son of Hammedatha, the what? I'm going to make you guys pronounce some stuff for once in a while, right? The Agagite. So just this little side note, a quick side note. So I have my Bible software that I use to study. I can click on a word and it'll pronounce it for me. But it's not helpful in this because if I did that up here, all these words have weird letters and sounds, and so I'm just going to say it like it looks like it's written, and we're going to go with that. So if I say it in a weird way, I apologize, but we get the picture. So it says that Haman is an Agagite. An Agagite, what does that come from? Well, the Amalekites, if you remember back in Jewish history, as the Israelites were freed from Egypt and they were going to the Promised Land. Well, they were on their way there continually harassed and persecuted and attacked by the Amalekites, trying to destroy them, doing wicked and evil things to the Israelites. And constantly. And because of this, God said that as judgment on the Amalekites, that they would be wiped out completely. And we don't see this happen immediately, but later on, as we read in 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see that King Saul, who was the first king of the Israelites, was given this command to go in and to wipe out the Amalekites, and specifically to kill their king, whose name was Agag. All right, so Agag was the king, and if you'll remember that story, they go in and King Saul wins the victory, and he comes to talk to the prophet and Nathan, and he says, well, look, I brought you the king. Here he is. And Nathan says, well, why did you bring him? You're supposed to kill him. You didn't obey God's commands. And not only that, but I hear all this bleating of sheep and livestock. You were supposed to wipe out everything. And Saul didn't obey the command of God. He wasn't surrendered to God's purpose that He had given to him. Now, King Agag ended up dying right after that because Nathan stepped up and killed him. But because of King Saul's disobedience, the Amalekites were not completely wiped out. The line of Agag was not wiped out. And so we see it hundreds of years later now pop up here in the book of Esther. And so it's important for us to realize where Haman came from, who he was an Agagite, from the line of King Agag, who hated the Israelites and the Jewish people. And so that gives us a little more context into, first of all, why Haman was so against the Jews and wanted to wipe them out. But it also helps us understand what happens when we do not obey the commands that God has given to us. We do not act in obedience. There are consequences. So not only do we see that surrender means doing the right thing, but we see that surrender means recognizing our purpose. So we're going to continue reading in chapter 4, beginning in verse 4 through the end of the chapter. You can follow along as I read out loud. It says this: Esther's female servants and her eunuchs came and reported the news to her, and the queen was overwhelmed with fear. So she was kind of on her own in this little enclave, and she didn't know what had happened. Mordecai and the other Israelites are out there mourning and lamenting, but she didn't know until her servants came in and told her. And her response was fear, understandably. She sent clothes, or actually this is when they just told her that Mordecai was outside in sackcloth and ashes. She didn't even know why he was doing this in verse 4. So she sent clothes for Mordecai to wear so that he would take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, to attend her, and dispatched him to Mordecai to learn what he was doing and why. She didn't know yet. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened, as well as the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay the royal treasury for the slaughter of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa ordering their destruction. So Hathach might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king, implore his favor, and plead with him personally for her people. Hathach came and repeated Mordecai's response to Esther. Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard and who has not been summoned. So she's saying, look, if everyone knows that if someone goes in before the king and they have not been summoned, that they deserve the death penalty. They can be killed unless the king extends the golden scepter, allowing that person to live. I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. Mordecai told the messenger, this poor guy, he's running back and forth between both of them. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. And so here is, an amazing part of the story. Esther now becomes aware through Mordecai telling this servant to go tell her of what has taken place. And her initial response is fear, and we understand that, and many times we've been in the same place. Her response was fear. Not only was her own life in danger, but everyone that she knew, all of her people. And how can she respond? And Mordecai says, well, our one hope, God's placed you there in the palace. You have the ear of the king. He likes you. He chose you. You need to go to him on our behalf and plead that he would spare the Jewish people. But she reminds him of what she knows to be true. And knowing King Ahasuerus and his anger and his responses to people, this was a real concern for her. She knew that if she just walked into the king's throne room to talk to him, that most likely she would be killed. In fact, I believe that it was King Ahasuerus who, one of his close friends, did this. Came in unannounced and without an appointment, and he had him killed to show that no one was beyond this. And so it wasn't like, well, he really liked her and she was the queen. Well, he also hadn't seen her in 30 days, which means she wasn't the only woman in his life. He had a whole harem of women. And so this is very risky for Queen Esther to take this on. But what does she conclude? After Mordecai's pep speech of saying, listen, God is going to save his people. Why did Mordecai believe that? Because he believed God's promises. He knew that this would not be successful because God had given them promises that they could hold on to. But he did say, listen, if you don't do this, God's going to save his people in another way, but you won't be spared. God has placed you in the palace for such a time as this. God has orchestrated all of these events and given you a specific purpose in your life. Now is the time to step up and to follow that purpose. And so after I'm sure, much stress and prayer, Esther says, I'll do it. And if I perish, I'll perish. See, surrender means recognizing your purpose. We were created by God for a purpose. You were created by God for a purpose. Have you ever asked yourself that? What is my purpose in life? You know that you were created in God's image, intricately fashioned by an almighty creator. But what were you created for? You specifically. What were you created for? You see, we desire purpose in our lives. It's what gets us up in the morning. It drives us. We were created for a purpose. We want to know what that purpose is. Everyone in this world seeks after a purpose. And if we don't find that purpose in our God-given purpose, we move to other things that will not satisfy, that we will chase after and never reach, never attain. But God has given us a purpose. If you have given your life to Christ, you have a purpose. The greatest question is, will you pursue it? Maybe it's the purpose of being a godly husband or wife, leading your family as a father or a mother, a leader, a neighbor, an evangelist, a disciple maker. And the list could go on. God has placed you exactly where you are with a purpose in mind to make an impact on those around you. It is not by mistake. It is not by chance. It is not by your doing even. God has a purpose for you in the place in which He has placed you. It may not be to save the lives of 15 million people, but every day we make choices that matter. Every day. I tell my kids this too, because a lot of times you think, well, when I'm a kid, you've maybe heard people say, well, that's a time to make dumb choices, right? Because they don't affect you as much. But the reality is every choice affects us. Even when we're young, our choices are building us into the people that we're going to be. And as we get older, our choices matter. Every day we make choices. Don't miss the little choices because you feel that they are insignificant. That doesn't matter that much. And don't shy away from the big ones because you feel that they're too risky. How often we do that? We may not be facing a death penalty, but there is life or death reality around us every day. If we understand the gospel of Jesus, we understand that reality. We are sinners, and that sin separates us from God, and the only way to be reconciled to God is through the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. And only when we place our faith and trust in Him alone for our salvation are we made right with God, are we reconciled to Him. And for those who do not trust in Jesus, who seek salvation in other means apart from Jesus, they face an eternity apart from God in a place called hell. That is the reality of the world, and it's a reality that should weigh heavy on us every single day. We should rejoice knowing that we are trusting in Jesus alone for our salvation, and our eternity is secured. But the reality of the lostness around us must weigh heavy on our hearts. And so we have choices to make, and conversations that we have, and risks that we take to share the gospel with those around us. Are you willing to take those risks? Because I guarantee you, God placed you where He has you for a purpose. And a big part of that purpose is to share His message of truth with those around you. They need to hear it. Thousands of people surround us that do not know the Lord, that have not believed in Jesus, that do not know the salvation that He freely offers, that will spend an eternity apart from Him in a place called hell if they do not turn to Him. How good we are at pushing that to the back of our minds when we wake up in the mornings and go about our day, as we talk to people that we know do not know Him. And we shrug our shoulders, not understanding God has placed us there for a purpose. Do we go through life apathetic to the lost that we interact with every day? I pray that we don't, but I know that reality in my own life, how easy it is for me to get in a place like that. We must remind ourselves that God has placed us where He has for a purpose. As we look at this, I'm reminded of Ephesians 2:10, which Laura read for us this morning. It says this, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do." You know what that means? It means that God has a purpose and a plan, and He has had a purpose and a plan for your life from the very beginning. Before you were formed and created, God knew you, and He knew what He wanted you to accomplish in life. He knew where He was going to place you, who He was going to have you impact. Before Esther was born, He knew that she would be in the palace at this time for this purpose, to save His people. He orchestrated it. It's His providence. But Esther, in that moment, had to choose to pursue God's plan for her life, to pursue His purpose. See, God is looking for those that will be surrendered to His purpose. 2 Chronicles 16 verse 9 says, "For the eyes of the Lord roam throughout the earth to show Himself strong for those who are wholeheartedly devoted to Him." Can we say that about our own lives? Are you wholeheartedly devoted to God's purpose for your life? Are you seeking after it? Are you pursuing it? Are you taking the risks? Are you obeying Him no matter the consequences? You see, we cannot sit back and say, well, this doesn't affect me. Mordecai warned Esther of that in verse 13. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, "Don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace." We can't sit back and say, well, it doesn't affect me that much. It does. We cannot sit back and act like we're not a part of God's plan and purpose. He's placed us here for a reason. God, here, I'm going to say this, and I want you to understand it, but I think it's important for us to know, and it's something that Mordecai really hones in on. Here's the reality. God doesn't need you. I know you might be offended by that. We don't like to hear that, do we? But that's the reality. God doesn't need you. Mordecai believed in God's promise, and he said this here. Look at verse 14. "If you keep silent at this time," talking to Esther, "relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place." He knows that God is going to answer the cries and the prayers of the Jewish people. God doesn't need Esther. God's not waiting up in heaven saying, "Oh, I really hope that Esther goes in before the king, or else I don't know what I'm going to do." And in the same way, God does not need you. God uses us, but He does not have to. His plan does not rise and fall based on our cooperation. But we should desire to be used by God. This is where I want to be. My prayer is that where God is working, I am there. That I am surrendered to His plan because I want to be a part of God's miraculous plan. When Esther surrendered to God, look at what God did through her. God does not have to use us, but He wants to use us. Are you surrendered to Him? Don't you want to be a part of what God is doing? I hope that you do. Scripture and history are filled with ordinary men and women that God used in an extraordinary way because they were surrendered to His purpose. Abraham, Joseph. I wish I could go into each one of these stories, but if you know them, you know God used these people just because they were surrendered in incredible ways. Each one of them is a story of God's providence. Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Ruth, Esther, David, Peter, Paul. These were not superhuman Christians. These were not just really good men and women that God said, oh, wow, they're so great, I need them to accomplish my plan. No, all of them had flaws. But God chose them and had a specific purpose for their lives, and they surrendered to God. They were not perfect, but they surrendered to His plan, and He used them and accomplished incredible things. God can do the same thing through your life when we are surrendered to Him. We need to have bravery like Esther to step up and act when necessary. To act. You know, if I'm going to be honest with us, and I'm not up here talking to you, I'm talking to myself as well. Some of us lack the courage to walk across the street and share the gospel with our neighbors, let alone walk into the presence of the most powerful man in the world at the time, risking likely death. God's purpose for us is not just to exist. We were created and commissioned to make an impact for the kingdom. Are you doing that where God has placed you? Or do we wake up every morning, go about our business, and then go to bed at night? Maybe we show up at church, maybe we read our Bible, but we are not impacting anything around us. That is not what God meant for us. It is not His purpose for your life. This is a reminder to me that I need to wake up, to listen to God, to look for His purpose for me, and to act. And I cannot do it in my own strength. Only through God's power working through me can I accomplish what He has called me to do. So I am fully and utterly dependent on Him. Don't settle for less. And so like Mordecai, do you believe God's promises? Do you want to be a part of His incredible plan? So surrender means knowing and surrendering to our purpose, God-given purpose. And finally, surrender means leaving the results to God. In verse 16, she says at the end, I'm going to go in before the king, and if I perish, I perish. In her mind, she wasn't thinking, well, if I obey God, then He's going to make everything great in my life. She knew the risk that she was taking. And many times, following God's purpose and plan for our lives requires risk. But we must leave the results to God. This reminds us of Paul. Remember, not too long ago, we went through the book of Acts. And remember, as Paul was going to Jerusalem, he wanted to stop in Ephesus, but they told him, don't do it, it's too dangerous. And so he went a little bit farther and stopped in a place called Miletus, and the elders from the church in Ephesus came down and met him there. And he gave his farewell speech to them. And this is what he said, Acts 20:22 through 24. And now I am on my way to Jerusalem, compelled by the Spirit, not knowing what I will encounter there, except that in every town the Holy Spirit warns me that chains and afflictions are waiting for me. But I consider my life of no value to myself. My purpose, there it is to finish my course and the ministry I received from the Lord Jesus, to testify to the gospel of God's grace. Just like Esther, we see Paul here saying, God has given me a purpose. I don't know what awaits me. In fact, what I do know of what awaits me is not good. But I'm going to pursue it because this is what God has called me to. And look how God used Paul. Look at the churches that were started, the testimony of his life, because he was surrendered to God's purpose. You see, God is working for our good and His glory. In our story here, we read in chapter 5, I'm just going to read the first 2 verses. It says, on the third day, Esther dressed in her royal clothing and stood in the inner courtyard. of the palace facing it. You can just see and imagine what she was feeling. She got all dressed up. She stands at the door to go into the palace, standing there thinking, this could be the end. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal courtroom, facing its entrance. So now the king is looking at her. He sees her. He knows that she wasn't summoned. Verse 2, as soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she gained favor with him. That's not a coincidence. That is God working in the king's heart. She gained favor with him. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther, and as she approached, she touched the tip of the scepter. Her life was spared. God rewarded her for her surrender to his plans and purpose. And so in this story, we see that it works out so far. In Paul's story, we know that his life was taken from him. So it's not in, I do the right thing so that God can spare my life or make things easy for me or give me health and wealth and all of these things. No, it's I surrender to God because his purpose is best. He knows what is best for me. And he is working in a far greater way than I could ever imagine. It reminds me of one of my favorite missionaries, and his name might be familiar because there's a school around here, Jim Elliot. He was a missionary to the Auca Indians in the Ecuadorian jungle. If you don't know this story, I'd encourage you to go research it. It's an incredible story. But basically, they were trying to reach this Indian tribe that had not been reached at all. And so over months, they tried to gain favor with them and access. And finally, when it came to the time where they went to them on the beach there, they were trying to gain favor with them, to talk with them, to let them know they were there to help. And it ended up, I won't go deep into the story, you can read it, but they were killed on that beach. These missionary men who gave everything to reach these people didn't even get a chance to share the gospel with them. They were killed. That could have been perceived as a failure, couldn't it? Like, why did they do this? Why did they knew this could probably happen. Why did they even spend the time doing this? There are other ways, or just let those people be. But they knew that these people needed the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they were willing to give their lives for that. Jim Elliot surrendered, and the other men. I don't want to take that away from them. But they surrendered to God, and look where that got him. He wasted his life, people might say, but Jim Elliot said this: he is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Just 2 years after he was killed, his wife Elizabeth Elliot went as a missionary along with a sister, Rachel, a saint of one of the other men. And many of the very people that killed her husband and her brother, Rachel's brother, accepted Christ. Many of those people came to a knowledge of Jesus Christ through the sacrifice of Jim and the other men. That was a key part of them coming to know the love of Christ. There's an open door to the gospel. Jim's life was not wasted. Just like Esther, Jim Elliot and Elizabeth Elliot were not perfect. They were not super Christians. They were simply surrendered to God's purpose for their life, no matter the cost. And when they stepped out in obedience, God used them in extraordinary ways. God can and will use you if you are surrendered to Him. And so as we close, I want to ask these two questions. One, are you committed to follow God in obedience no matter the consequences? You must determine that in your own mind. What God asked me to do, I'm going to do it. I know that I will not be perfect, but I am surrendered to His will and His purpose for my life. Is that true in your life and in your heart? Or are you content in just existing, waking up, going about things for yourself and your own life? Or are you surrendered to God's purpose for your life? Does that go into every choice that you make? And secondly, Are you wholeheartedly surrendered to God's purpose for your life? Do what God has called you to do, where He has placed you, and leave the results up to Him. You will not be disappointed. You will not live a boring life. I can guarantee that. You will not look back with regret. God has a unique purpose and plan for your life. Will you surrender to it? Let's pray.